The moment I saw the document, my breath caught. My fingers hovered above the heavy cream-colored paper as if touching it would scorch me. The heading, bold and merciless, declared Petition for Conservatorship. I had read those words a dozen times already, yet each glance felt like a new wound. Beneath the heading in neat black print stood the petitioner's name, Peter Miller, my own son. The office of David Chen. My lawyer was elegant but cold in the way places built for power often are. Dark wood paneling, a long leather couch under a row of framed law degrees, a polished walnut desk between us is like a barricade. I could smell the faint, almost comforting scent of leather ink and something old, old paper maybe, or perhaps the lingering weight of other people's battles. Outside the wide window behind David's chair, the city kept moving yellow cabs, honking pedestrians hurrying with coffees and phones, the late afternoon light bouncing off glass towers. But in that room, time seemed to slow as if even the air was holding its breath. I lowered my gaze to the legal text again. Diminished mental capacity, incapable of making sound decisions, erratic financial behavior. Each phrase landed like a slap, as if the law itself had misremembered me, had painted me into the image of a frail, confused old woman who needed to be controlled. Petitioner Peter Miller. Nominee for Conservator Peter Miller. My only child. A question pulsed in my mind with each beat of my heart. How did it come to this? How does a mother, giver, protector, the person who once held that boy's tiny fingers as he learned to walk, find herself branded as incompetent? Her autonomy put on trial by the very life she brought into the world, I set the paper down carefully on David's desk, though my hand trembled. The polished wood reflected my face thinner than I remembered, with lines that suddenly seemed carved deeper by sorrow. My thoughts drifted backward, searching for the crack in the foundation the moment the ground beneath us began to crumble. It hadn't started with a fight or an accusation, not even a harsh word. It had begun with something far more chilling: silence. First came the silence of a phone that didn't ring, then the silence of a Sunday dinner table where the pot roast cooled untouched, a silence so heavy it felt like an invisible wall being built between us. And then the silence was shattered by an image. It wasn't a nightmare, it was a Facebook post. I can still see it as vividly as if the screen were glowing before me now. I'd stumbled across it by accident on the profile of one of Grace's friends. A photo album from a wedding at a picturesque winery in Napa Valley, rows of wooden barrels in the background, the vines draped in gold under the late summer sun. And there at the center of it all stood my son Peter, in a black tuxedo, grinning in that lopsided way he had as a boy when he won a soccer game. Beside him, in a delicate white lace gown, was Grace, her eyes sparkling, her head resting against his shoulder. Around them stood friends, cousins, Grace's parents, all raising glasses of champagne. Beneath the photo, in looping cursive, the caption read, "Congratulations to the most wonderful couple, so happy to be part of your intimate circle." Intimate circle. The words pierced me like glass. I, the groom's mother, the woman who had taken out $400,000 from her retirement savings so they could buy their first home and pay off debts, had not been part of that circle. I hadn't even known there was a wedding to be invited to. I remember sitting that night in the living room, the glow of the phone screen gone black, the house dark except for the faint porch light seeping in through the curtains. I didn't cry. I just sat there staring at nothing as if all the air had been drained out of the world. And now here I was, weeks later, holding a legal petition signed by my son. I understood then. The circle drawn that day at the winery wasn't just to exclude me from their happiness. It was to place me outside their lives, to isolate me, to strip me of more than love, to strip me of my dignity, my independence, perhaps even my very name as a mother. The wedding had been their opening move. This petition was the final blow. Helen. David's voice cut gently through the haze. He was watching me from across the desk, hands clasped in a lawyer's practiced calm. Are you ready? We need to respond to this petition. We can fight it, but you have to be fully with me. I looked up at him into his steady eyes. For a moment, I thought I might cry, but the tears that had threatened earlier were gone, replaced by something colder, heavier, like steel settling into my spine. They want a war, I heard myself say, and the sound of my voice startled me. It was firmer, lower, almost unfamiliar. Then I'll give them one. David nodded slightly as if that was exactly the answer he had been waiting for. Good. We'll begin with the response filing. There's still time to stop this before it gains momentum. I straightened my back, took a deep breath, and laid my hand flat on the desk as if sealing a vow. Tell me where we begin. David's words still echoed in my ears as I drove home through the thinning rush hour traffic. The city streets blurred past the windshield brick buildings, giving way to rows of modest houses. His voice had been calm, deliberate. The first thing is not to panic. The burden of proof is on them. They have to convince the court that you've lost capacity. Our job is to prove the opposite. Simple words, but they had steadied me. Still, the knot in my chest refused to loosen. The sky was bruised purple as I turned onto my quiet street. Porch lights blinked on, one by one, windows glowing with families settling in for dinner. My own house waited at the end of the block, its gabled roof outlined against the dusk. I parked, sat for a moment with my hands on the wheel, and let the silence wrap around me. That same silence that had started all of this. It had been a typical Sunday afternoon only a month ago. I remember that day in sharp detail as if my mind keeps replaying it to understand where everything began to fracture. I had woken up early to prepare a Memphis-style pot roast, the kind Peter used to love as a teenager. The smell of slow-roasted beef and onions and paprika filled the house warm and comforting. I set the dining table with my mother's old china, just 3 places, one for me, one for Peter, one for Grace. The late afternoon sun slanted across the tablecloth, turning the glassware to liquid gold. I hummed to myself as I basted the roast. A simple dinner, but it felt like a ritual of love, a way of telling my son and his wife without words that they were still my family. 6 o'clock came, then 6:30. At 7 I called Peter. The call went straight to voicemail. I tried Grace. The little icon on my phone told me she had read my message but sent no reply. I left the roast in the oven on low, hoping they were just caught in traffic. By 8, I sat alone at the dining table, staring at the candle I had lit the wax, dripping slowly down the white taper. The roast cooled the gravy, thickened the air, filled with a scent that had gone from welcoming to hollow. A meal meant to feed 3 became a silent dinner for 1. The next day passed without a word. So did the one after that. No calls, no explanations. I told myself they were busy, that something unexpected had come up, but the truth felt heavier. A wall was rising between us, built brick by brick out of unspoken neglect. Then on Tuesday evening, I saw it. I was scrolling through my phone, absent-mindedly trying to distract myself with the endless scroll of other people's lives, when a photograph froze me mid-motion. A vineyard bathed in golden light, rows of oak barrels behind a long table set with candles and crystal glasses, and in the center, Peter and Grace him, in a tuxedo, her in a lace gown surrounded by smiling faces I barely recognized. A wedding, my son's wedding. My son's wedding that I hadn't even known was happening. I remember how my breath left me in a rush. I read the caption beneath the photo once, then again, my eyes snagging on 2 words that glittered with cruelty. Intimate circle. I sat there all night in the living room, the only light coming from the muted television, my hands resting in my lap. I didn't cry. I was past crying. I just felt hollow, like an abandoned house whose windows had been boarded shut. The next morning, the phone rang. My heart leapt. Finally, I thought, an explanation, an apology. I picked it up. It was Grace. Her voice was bright, almost cheerful, as if nothing had happened. Hi, Helen. Just a quick thing. Peter's payment on the new SUV is due soon and our credit cards are maxed out. Could you transfer the money for us before the end of the week? For a heartbeat, I couldn't speak. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the distant bark of a neighbor's dog outside, as if the world itself were holding its breath. No mention of the wedding, not even a perfunctory invitation, just money. When I found my voice, it came out low and even as if someone else were speaking through me. Grace. I said I thought things like that were only for people in the intimate circle. The line went quiet, then her tone shifted, sharp, annoyed. What are you talking about? Are you upset about the wedding? We just wanted something small and private. You're an adult. Why are you being so petty about little things? Little things. My only son's wedding was a little thing. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I'm not being petty, Grace, I said. I'm just learning my place. The call ended with the cold, mechanical beep of disconnection. I stared at the phone for a long while, the silence in the room growing heavier, pressing down on my chest. Less than 2 hours later, I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. I peered through the curtain. Their white BMW was parked at the curb. I knew what was coming, a confrontation. Grace didn't even wait to be invited in. She stepped over the threshold, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor. You need to calm down, Helen. She began, her tone carrying the rehearsed patience of someone addressing a difficult child. You're overreacting. Overreacting, I echoed, my voice rising despite myself. Being excluded from my own son's wedding and then getting a phone call asking for money as if nothing happened, that's overreacting. Peter, standing just behind her, shifted uncomfortably, his hands stuffed in his pockets. Mom, it's not like that, he said, his voice softer, almost pleading. Everything happened so fast. We were going to come and talk to you afterward. Grace stepped closer, her expression softening as she reached out as though to take my hand. We know we were wrong not to tell you. We're truly sorry, but you have to understand my parents paid for the wedding. If they knew we still depended on you financially, what would they think of Peter? We were just trying to protect his dignity. I stared at her. Protect his dignity by stripping me of mine. The logic was twisted, cruel. When I didn't respond, her face hardened, the soft mask dropping away to reveal the steel beneath. Fine, she said sharply, if you want to be blunt. After all, everything you have will go to Peter eventually anyway, right? What are you going to do with all that money by yourself? The words struck like a slap. And if this self starts acting strangely, I shoot back, you'll find a way to get it sooner, won't you? For a brief second, a flicker of something cold crossed her face. Then she smiled a thin, sharp smile. I'm just warning you, Helen. If you keep this up, we might have to talk to a lawyer. A judge might decide you're no longer competent to manage your own affairs. That was the moment the last fragile thread between us snapped. I felt the old warmth in my chest turn to ice. I pointed to the door. Get out of my house, now, before I call the police. The slam of the door reverberated through the hallway like the crack of a rifle. I stood there for a long time, my hands still outstretched, my heart pounding in my ears. The house was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now, no longer heavy with hurt, but sharpened by resolve. I knew then that the real battle had begun. I didn't sleep that night. The confrontation replayed in my mind in jagged fragments, the glint in Grace's eyes, the hollow look on Peter's face, the way the door slammed as if sealing a tomb. I sat in the living room long after midnight, the lamp throwing a pale circle of light on the rug, the rest of the house swallowed in shadow. I kept thinking of the boy Peter used to be, the boy who once cried when he dropped his ice cream cone, who once promised he would take care of me when I grew old. That boy felt as distant as the moon. By dawn, I had made coffee so strong it burned my throat. I drank it anyway. I needed the bitterness. It kept me awake, kept me from breaking. Outside, the sky was still the color of ashes when I heard the low hum of a car engine. I went to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to see. The white BMW was back glinting under the street lamp. My heart kicked up. They were coming again. The doorbell rang a moment later, sharp, insistent. I didn't move right away. I let it ring a second time, then a third. Finally, I opened the door. Peter stood there, hands in his jacket pockets, eyes downcast. Grace was beside him, already wearing that composed smile that never reached her eyes. Can we talk? Peter asked, his voice subdued. I stepped aside without answering. They walked in as if they still belonged here. The air felt heavier the moment they entered, as if the walls themselves sensed the tension. Grace began without preamble, her tone clipped but falsely polite. Helen last night got out of hand. We didn't come here to fight. We just want to clear the air. Clear the air, I repeated, settling into the armchair across from them. Is that what you call threatening your husband's mother with a conservatorship? Grace's smile faltered, then returned thinner this time. It wasn't a threat. It was just something that might happen if things keep going the way they are. We're worried about you. I laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. Worried about me. Because I stopped writing checks for you. Peter shifted in his seat, rubbing his palms together. Mom, it's not like that. We just think you've been under a lot of stress. Maybe it's affecting your judgment. My judgment. I leaned forward, my voice steady but edged with steel. The only judgment I question is yours, both of you. You hide your wedding from me. You take hundreds of thousands of dollars from my savings. And when I finally say enough, you call me unstable. Peter opened his mouth as if to reply, but said nothing. Grace, sensing his hesitation, stepped in. Her voice grew sharper. Helen, you have to understand this isn't personal. We're just thinking about the future. You're 66. At some point, you might need someone to take care of your finances. Wouldn't it be better if it were your son rather than some stranger? There it was, the polished version of last night's threat. I felt something inside me harden like clay left too long in the sun. Better for whom, I asked quietly. Grace's gaze didn't waver. Better for everyone. For you. For us. We're a family. I held her eyes for a long moment. Family, I said at last. A family doesn't ambush their own mother. A family doesn't hold her love and her independence hostage. Grace sighed dramatically and sat back, crossing her arms. We're trying to do what's best. If you keep pushing us away, you'll leave us no choice. The court will listen when we explain our concerns. That sentence hung in the air like the toll of a bell. For a heartbeat, I said nothing. Then I stood, my movements slow but deliberate. I want you to leave, I said. Peter looked at me, startled. Mom. Now I said, my voice as cold as the morning air seeping in from the front door. Leave my house. Grace opened her mouth to protest, then thought better of it. She rose, gathering her coat. Peter followed, his face pale, his eyes avoiding mine. As the door shut behind them, the lock clicking into place, I stood alone in the hallway. My reflection in the glass of the framed photograph stared back at me, older. Yes, but resolute. I felt no triumph, only a heavy calm. I knew I had just crossed an invisible line. Whatever fragile thread of affection remained between us had been severed. I walked back to the living room and sank into the armchair, listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator, the distant whir of a neighbor's lawn sprinkler. Ordinary sounds in an ordinary house. Yet I knew my life had shifted. For the first time in years, I was no longer merely Peter's mother, no longer the provider waiting for gratitude that never came. I was my own defender now. I thought of David's words the day before. We can fight this, but only if you're ready. I was ready, not for reconciliation, not for compromise, for war. The morning after that confrontation, I woke before dawn. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the faint hum of the heater filling the quiet house, the weight of what had been said, of what had been threatened, pressed against my chest. But beneath it was something else, resolve. If they wanted to treat me as weak, I would show them how wrong they were. I made coffee strong and black and drank it standing at the kitchen counter. The taste was sharp like a challenge. By the time the sun began to edge over the rooftops, I was on the phone with David. He answered on the second ring, his voice calm but alert. Helen, he said, did they come back last night? They came in the morning, I told him. They said they were worried about me, said the court would understand. I told them to leave. There was a pause, then a quiet sigh on the other end of the line. You did the right thing. We have to move fast. The best way to defend yourself is to be prepared before they act again. I want to protect everything I've worked for, I said. I won't let them take what I spent a lifetime building. Then let's start by securing your home, David replied. I'll recommend a security company, and we should also talk about your finances. A trust might be the right move. By mid-morning, a white van with blue lettering pulled into my driveway. Two technicians stepped out carrying toolboxes. Their presence felt strange at first, strangers drilling into my door frames and wiring cameras above the porch, but there was a certain comfort in the sound of the drill in the sight of the new electronic lock snapping into place. It was the sound of a fortress being built, not of fear, but of boundaries. I stood with my arms folded as the lead technician showed me how to set up a code, how to see visitors on the camera feed. Each click of the keypad felt like a small victory. That afternoon, I met David at his office. The sky was heavy with rain clouds as I walked into the familiar lobby, the smell of polished wood and paper greeting me like an old ally. We went over everything: my savings, my 401k, my investment accounts, the deed to the house. He explained the benefits of an irrevocable trust, a structure that would make it far harder for anyone, even family, to gain control over my assets without my consent. Are you sure you're ready for this? He asked gently as he slid the paperwork across the desk. I picked up the pen and looked at my own name written in neat type at the top of the page. For a moment, I thought of Robert, my late husband, of the small house we had first bought together, of the decades of work and saving and sacrifice that had brought me here. Then I signed. The pen moved steadily without hesitation. I didn't feel as if I were surrendering control. I felt as if I were finally taking it back. That night, as I locked the new deadbolt and set the security alarm, I thought the worst was over. But the next morning, I opened my social media account and saw the first of Grace's posts. It was a photo of a glass of wine on a porch with a sunset in the background. The caption read, "Sometimes it's hard watching loved ones slip away from reality." No names mentioned, none needed. Friends of hers began commenting, offering sympathy, asking if she was all right. She replied to them with vague but suggestive words. By noon, I received a call from my sister-in-law in Florida, her voice thick with disapproval. "Helen," she said, "what's going on up there? Grace says you've been struggling. Is everything all right?" I swallowed the hurt that rose in my throat. "I'm fine," I said carefully. "Please don't believe everything you see on Facebook." But I could feel the shift, the slow turning of the tide. In the grocery store that week, I caught two acquaintances whispering near the produce section, their glances sliding toward me. I turned away and walked on. I had no intention of explaining my life to strangers. It was during one of those gray afternoons while I was tending my small garden in the front yard that I first spoke to Carol. She lived across the street, a widow in her 70s with bright eyes and a habit of wearing colorful scarves even on dull days. I had seen her before, but we had never exchanged more than polite greetings. That day, seeing me kneeling by the flower bed, she came over carrying a mug of tea. "You look like you could use a friend," she said kindly. I surprised myself by laughing a short, dry laugh. I suppose I could. We stood there, the wind tugging at the leaves, and I found myself telling her pieces of the story about the wedding I hadn't been invited to, about the petition, about the sense of being surrounded by silence and suspicion. Carol listened without interrupting. When I finished, she rested a warm, firm hand on my arm. "My brother tried something similar with me after our parents passed," she said quietly. "He wanted control of everything. I had to fight him in court to keep my independence. I know how it feels." For a moment I couldn't speak. Then I asked, "How did you get through it?" Her eyes softened. "You remember who you are. You lean on the people who respect you. True love never comes with control. The people who truly care will stand beside you, not try to own you." Her words settled into me like a steadying breath. In that moment, on that small patch of grass between two neighbors' houses, I felt less alone. In the weeks that followed, Carol's presence became an unexpected blessing. She checked on me sometimes, just bringing over a plate of cookies or a new book. We shared quiet evenings on our porches, sipping tea and talking about everything and nothing. While David handled the legal battles, Carol helped keep my heart steady. I still felt the sting of betrayal from Peter, the ache of knowing my son had turned against me. But each step I took, signing the trust, installing the cameras, finding an ally, built a wall of protection, not to shut the world out, but to hold myself together. For the first time in a long while, I felt that my life was my own again. The envelope arrived on a rainy Thursday morning. I heard the soft thud as it landed on the doormat, followed by the hiss of tires on the wet street outside. When I picked it up, the return address on the upper left corner made my stomach tighten. County Probate Court. My fingers trembled slightly as I tore it open. The words were plain but heavy. Petition for conservatorship. The hearing was set for 3 weeks from that day. I stood in the hallway staring at the paper until the letters seemed to blur together. I had known this moment was coming, but knowing didn't make the blow any softer. I called David immediately. He answered on the first ring. I could hear the rustle of papers in the background as if he had been expecting my call. They filed it, I said flatly. Take a deep breath, he replied. His voice was calm, steady. We've prepared for this. They have to prove you're incapable of managing your own affairs. We both know that isn't true. I still can't believe Peter is doing this, I whispered, though I'd been saying it to myself for weeks. He's my son. There was a pause on the other end, then David said gently, I know, but you need to think of this as a legal challenge, not a personal one. We'll fight it in court and we'll win. After we hung up, I stood at the window watching the rain beat on the glass. The street outside looked washed out, the trees bending under the weight of the storm. I wondered if Peter felt anything as he signed his name to that petition. Did he hesitate? Did he remember the summers we spent in the old cabin by the lake, the nights he crawled into my bed after bad dreams? Or was all that too far gone now? That afternoon, David came to my house. He brought a neat folder filled with documents and lists, medical records, bank statements, letters from my physician confirming my good health and sound mind. We sat at the dining table, the same table where Peter had once done his homework, and went over every detail. I found myself sitting straighter as we worked my initial shock, giving way to focus. We'll also need a character witness, David said, someone who can speak to your mental clarity and independence, preferably someone outside the family. Carol, I said without thinking. She's seen everything that's happened these past few months. David nodded. She'll be perfect. The next day I crossed the street and knocked on Carol's door. She welcomed me in with a smile and the scent of freshly baked bread. I need to ask you for something, I said once we were seated at her kitchen table. She listened as I explained about the petition and the hearing. Her eyes sharpened, but her voice stayed calm. Of course I'll testify, she said. You're not the one who's lost her grip on reality. I've seen you handle your life just fine. I'll tell the court that. A wave of relief passed through me, though it didn't wash away all the worry. Thank you, I said softly. The days leading up to the hearing passed in a strange mix of routine and tension. I still tended to my garden, still went for my morning walks, still brewed my coffee the way I always had. But every quiet moment was haunted by the knowledge that soon I would have to sit in a courtroom and listen as my own son's lawyer tried to paint me as unfit. 2 nights before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the living room wrapped in a shawl, listening to the ticking of the old clock on the mantel. I thought of Robert, of the steady way he had always faced challenges. I wondered what he would say to me now. I imagined his voice. You've always been stronger than you think, and somehow it helped. On the morning of the hearing, I dressed carefully in a navy blue suit and a white blouse. I pinned back my hair, put on a pair of small pearl earrings, and looked in the mirror. The woman staring back at me wasn't frail or confused. She was determined, prepared. David met me outside the courthouse. His presence, calm and confident, was an anchor. Carol was already waiting in the hallway outside the courtroom, holding a small handbag and giving me a reassuring smile. I took a deep breath before we entered. The room was cold, with rows of wooden benches and the judge's bench looming at the front. Peter was already seated at the petitioner's table wearing a dark suit. He didn't look at me as I walked past. Grace sat beside him, her expression smooth, unreadable. The proceedings began with formalities, the clerk reading the petition, the judge outlining the purpose of the hearing. Then Peter's attorney stood and began his argument. He spoke of concern for Helen's well-being, of signs of diminished capacity. He mentioned my refusal to provide financial support, my decision to change locks and install cameras as if these were symptoms of paranoia rather than measures of protection. I sat quietly, my hands folded in my lap, listening to words that might have cut me deeply if I hadn't steeled myself against them. When the attorney finally said, "We believe Mrs. Helen needs a conservator to manage her personal and financial affairs," I saw Peter shift slightly as if even he found the words hard to hear. David rose and countered calmly but firmly. He presented evidence of my sound mind, the medical reports, the stable finances, the fact that I had continued to live independently and manage my home. Then he called Carol to the stand. She walked up with unhurried steps, her scarf a bright touch of color against the somber courtroom. She spoke plainly, describing our conversations, my day-to-day activities, the clarity she had seen in my decisions. Her voice never wavered. I watched the judge nod slightly as she spoke. When it was my turn to testify, I walked to the witness stand with deliberate steps. I answered the questions clearly, without anger, without apology. I spoke of my years of work, of raising Peter, of managing my own finances since Robert's death. I admitted that I had felt betrayed by my son's choices, but I emphasized that my decisions had been rational, not impulsive. At one point, as I glanced across the room, I caught Peter looking at me. There was something in his eyes, hesitation, maybe even regret, but it passed quickly as he turned away. The hearing lasted nearly 4 hours. When the judge finally said she would review the testimony and deliver her decision within 2 weeks, I felt both drained and strangely lighter. The battle wasn't over, but I had faced it head on. As we left the courthouse, David said quietly, "You did well today. You came across as strong and composed. That matters." Carol touched my arm gently. "Whatever happens, you're not alone in this." I looked up at the gray afternoon sky, the courthouse steps stretching behind me, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. The fight wasn't finished, but I had stood my ground. That counted for something. The days after the hearing stretched out like a taut wire. Each morning I woke before dawn, lying still in the half-light, listening to the quiet of the house. The silence felt different now, less like loneliness, more like the breath held before a verdict. I tried to keep to my routines. I brewed my coffee, read the paper, trimmed the wilted blooms in the garden, but even the smallest tasks seemed to carry the weight of waiting. I wondered constantly what Peter was thinking, whether he regretted what he had done or if he was already preparing for the next step. The neighborhood, which had once felt like a safe and ordinary place, now seemed watchful. One afternoon, as I returned from the grocery store, I noticed a car idling halfway down the street. A man I didn't recognize sat behind the wheel, glancing down at his phone. I told myself it was nothing, but my stomach tightened all the same. A few days later, I was in the backyard watering the rose bushes when my phone buzzed. The screen showed an unfamiliar number. I hesitated, then answered. "Mrs. Helen?" a clipped male voice asked. "Yes. This is Officer Ramirez from the local precinct. We received a call about a possible welfare concern at your address. Would you be available this afternoon for a quick visit?" For a moment, the world tilted. I felt the hose slip from my fingers, spraying water over the grass. "Someone reported me," I asked. "It's routine," he said in a neutral tone. "We just need to confirm everything's all right." After I hung up, I stood in the yard with my heart thudding hard in my chest. I didn't need to wonder who had made that call. When the officers arrived later that day, I met them at the door. I had already laid out my medication in neat rows on the kitchen table, my bills filed and stacked beside them, my refrigerator stocked with fresh groceries. I offered them tea. They politely declined, but looked around, noting the clean rooms, the locked medicine cabinet, the organized shelves. "You seem perfectly capable, ma'am," Officer Ramirez said finally. "We'll note that in our report." When they left, I closed the door and leaned against it for a long moment. The house was quiet again, but it felt as if a new line had been crossed. The attack was no longer confined to the courtroom or social media. Now it had entered my home. That evening, Carol came over. I told her what had happened. She listened, her face tightening as I spoke. They're trying to build a case against you, she said. They want to show you can't live on your own. I know, I said quietly, but I won't let them twist my life into their story. Carol reached across the table and took my hand. Then we'll make sure they can't. You have people standing with you. Don't forget that. Her words were a small anchor in a churning sea. The next day, David called to update me. The judge has requested additional documentation, he said. That can be a good sign. It means she's looking closely at the facts. I told him about the welfare check. There was a brief silence on the line. That's a low tactic, he said finally, but it's also something we can use. It shows they're trying to create doubt rather than prove it. Later that week, I went for a walk at the park. The air was crisp, the leaves turning shades of amber and gold. I passed families with strollers, joggers, and bright sneakers, teenagers tossing a football back and forth. For a while, I just kept walking, letting the rhythm of my steps steady my thoughts. I remembered the times Peter had run ahead of me on these same trails, a small boy in a red jacket turning to shout for me to catch up. I remembered the way he used to reach for my hand when we crossed the street. That boy felt so close in my memory, yet the man he had become seemed like a stranger living behind familiar eyes. I sat on a bench and watched the sunlight slide across the lake's surface. My heart ached, but beneath the ache there was something like clarity. I wasn't fighting just for money or property. I was fighting for the right to remain myself unbent, unowned. That night, as I locked the door and set the security alarm, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. I saw the lines of age on my face, but I also saw a steadiness there that hadn't always been present. I realized then that I was no longer waiting for someone to rescue me or for Peter to change. I was preparing to stand alone if I had to. I switched off the lights, the hum of the alarm, a soft reminder that the fortress I had built was holding. But I also knew that the real battle was not with locks or cameras. It was with the stories others told about me and the story I was determined to keep telling about myself. The morning of the hearing arrived cold and bright. I woke before sunrise, the sky outside my bedroom window still veiled in a deep indigo. For a moment I lay still, listening to the soft tick of the clock on the nightstand, trying to gather myself. Today I would have to face my son and his wife in court, not as a mother, but as a respondent in a legal battle for my own autonomy. I dressed slowly, choosing the navy blue suit I had picked days earlier. The fabric felt solid beneath my fingers, almost like armor. I pinned my hair back in a simple twist and added a pair of pearl earrings. I wanted the judge to see not an old woman in need of protection, but a composed and capable person. David met me outside the courthouse. He greeted me with a firm nod, his presence steady and unhurried. "You ready, Helen?" he asked. "As ready as I'll ever be," I said, forcing a small smile. Inside the courtroom was smaller than I had imagined, but charged with a tense energy. The wooden benches creaked as people shifted in their seats. I caught sight of Peter and Grace across the room. Grace was clutching Peter's arm as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Peter avoided my eyes, his expression a tight mask. The judge entered, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes that missed nothing. We all stood as she took her seat behind the bench, then sat again as the proceedings began. Their lawyer started first painting a picture of a devoted son who had made the heartbreaking decision to protect his mother. His voice was smooth, rehearsed, almost soothing. He spoke of my declining capacity, of erratic financial decisions, of my supposed vulnerability. I listened quietly, my hands folded in my lap, feeling as if he were describing a stranger. Grace was called to the stand next. She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue and told the court how worried she had been for me, how I had become difficult, forgetful, unstable. Her voice trembled at just the right moments. I could almost admire the performance if it hadn't been built on lies. David rose for the cross-examination, his posture calm but his questions precise as a scalpel. "Mrs. Miller," he began, "you say you were concerned about your mother-in-law's well-being. Can you explain then why you chose not to invite her to your wedding? Grace blinked rapidly, clearly not expecting the question. We we just wanted a small private ceremony. Private, David echoed, leaning slightly forward. Or were you concerned that your parents would learn that you and your husband were still financially dependent on Mrs. Miller? That's not, Grace began, but David didn't let the momentum slip. Isn't it true, he continued, that over the past 5 years you and your husband received more than $400,000 from Mrs. Miller? Was she at any point during that time mentally unfit to manage her finances? Grace's lips pressed together. It was voluntary help, she muttered. David's voice stayed steady, so the only time you questioned her mental fitness was when she decided to stop providing financial support. Is that correct? Grace's gaze fell to her lap. I don't remember the exact. When was the last time you called her simply to ask how she was, without mentioning money? David asked quietly. The silence that followed was heavier than any answer. Peter was called next. My son looked drawn, his jaw tight. He repeated the narrative they had prepared about my supposed decline, but his words lacked conviction. David's eyes stayed on him as he asked Mr. Miller, "You're 35 years old and have a stable job. Why are you still financially dependent on your mother's retirement savings? Isn't it true that the only change in her behavior was her choice to stop funding your and your wife's lifestyle?" Peter shifted in the witness chair, unable to meet David's gaze. "It's not that simple," he muttered. "Perhaps not," David replied evenly, "but it is that straightforward." The pharmacist testified next, confirming that Grace had once asked about sedatives for me, implying without cause that I was becoming paranoid. Carol came forward after him, her voice warm but resolute, as she described my lucidity, my independence, and the steps I had taken to protect myself. Finally, the report from Dr. Kovacs was presented, stating in clear, unequivocal language that I was fully competent in both mind and judgment. When it was my turn to speak, I stood and walked to the witness stand. My knees trembled for an instant, but I steadied myself and looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor." I began, my voice steady but carrying the weight of years I have spent my whole life trying to be a good mother. I believe that if I gave without asking in return, if I sacrificed without hesitation, I would be repaid with love and respect. I was wrong. Love that is treated as an obligation, sacrifice that is treated as a debt, is not love, it's a transaction. I paused, letting the words settle. Peter shifted in his seat but didn't look at me. I stand here today not to reclaim money. I continued, I stand here to reclaim my dignity. I am here because I believe that a woman, any woman, at any age, has the right to be respected as a person. She has the right to make her own decisions, to live her own life, and to be seen not as a burden or an asset, but as a human being. I am not incompetent. I am simply relearning how to love myself after a lifetime of loving others. The courtroom was utterly silent. Even the judge's pen had stilled above her notepad. When I returned to my seat, my heart was pounding, but not from fear. For the first time in a long while, I felt as if I had truly spoken my truth. The judge deliberated for what felt like an eternity, then returned with her decision. Her voice was firm, her words deliberate. After reviewing the evidence, testimony, and reports presented, the court finds the petition of Mr. Peter Miller to be without merit and motivated by financial interest. Mrs. Helen Miller is fully competent to manage her personal and financial affairs. The petition is denied in its entirety. She looked directly at Peter and Grace before continuing. The court reminds the petitioners that elder financial abuse is a serious matter. Family love must be built on respect, not control or dependency. A sharp rap of the gavel echoed through the room. The sound was like the first clear breath after years of suffocation. I sat very still, feeling the weight lift from my shoulders. I did not look at Peter or Grace as I gathered my things. I simply rose and walked out of the courtroom beside David, my steps slow but certain. A year has passed since the gavel came down and the courtroom fell silent. Sometimes it feels like a lifetime ago. Other days it feels like yesterday. The memory of that moment still lives in me, the sound of the judge's voice, the weight of her words lifting the invisible chains I hadn't realized had bound me for so long. Freedom, I've learned, doesn't always arrive with celebration. Sometimes it arrives quietly like a dawn that has been waiting behind the night. The first thing I did after the hearing was sell the house. It had once been a place of warmth and laughter, but now it carried too many ghost echoes of dinners gone cold, phone calls unanswered, and doors slammed in anger. Packing was harder than I expected. Every drawer held some fragment of my life: Peter's old report cards, Robert's watch photographs of holidays where we still smiled without pretending. I kept some, gave away others. When I handed the keys to the realtor, I felt a pang deep in my chest, followed by a strange, liberating lightness. I was closing a door, but I was also opening another. I bought a modern condo in the heart of the city, a space filled with sunlight and quiet strength. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked a skyline that shimmered each night like a constellation within reach. I furnished it simply: soft colors, open shelves, plants that reached for the light. It wasn't a house full of memories. It was a home for the person I was becoming. With part of the proceeds from the sale, I did something that surprised even me. I established a foundation in Robert's name, the Robert Miller Foundation. Its purpose was simple but vital: to provide free legal aid to low-income seniors facing predatory conservatorship or financial abuse. I wanted others to have the help I almost didn't know I needed. Pain, when transformed, can become a purpose. I suppose that was my way of giving meaning to the scars. The months that followed were quieter. I began to rediscover who I was beyond the roles I'd played for decades: wife, mother, provider. I signed up for a sculpture class at a small art studio downtown. The first time I touched the cool weight of clay, I felt something stir in me, something ancient and alive. My hands moved awkwardly at first, uncertain, after years spent tending to others instead of myself, but soon they remembered the language of creation. I shaped faces, hands, fragments of stories. Each piece felt like a conversation between who I was and who I was becoming. In the afternoons after class, I often walked along the riverfront. I watched couples strolling hand in hand, children chasing pigeons, artists sketching on park benches. Life continued in its gentle, unassuming rhythm. I was learning to move with it again. Travel followed. Italy was first: Florence, to see Michelangelo's David. I remember standing before that sculpture, staring at the strength in marble, the defiance caught in stillness. I felt tears prick my eyes. I wasn't crying for sadness, but recognition. Creation born from struggle, beauty carved from resistance. It was a story I understood. From there, I went to the Amalfi Coast, then Paris, then New Mexico, where the desert stretched wide and wild beneath a sky that never seemed to end. In each place, I found a piece of myself waiting to be reclaimed. Peter and Grace, I haven't seen them since the day of the verdict. Word travels, though. I hear through distant relatives that they sold their luxury condo and downsized to a modest home in the suburbs. Grace, I'm told, works full time now. Peter has taken on extra projects to keep up with expenses. I don't wish them harm. I don't wish them anything at all. Some distances can't be crossed again, not even with regret. Sometimes in the quiet evenings, I pour myself a glass of wine and step out onto the balcony. From there, the city stretches below me, 1,000 lights flickering like heartbeat rhythms against the dark. I think of the woman I used to be, the one who gave without question, who confused love with sacrifice, who mistook silence for peace. I think of her gently, almost with affection, because she had to exist for me to arrive here. Carol still visits often. We drink tea, share stories, and laugh about how life, even in its cruelest turns, can still surprise us with grace. She once told me, some people spend their whole lives building walls to keep pain out. You built one to keep yourself safe long enough to rebuild from within. I think she's right. I am 66 years old. The number doesn't scare me anymore. I no longer measure my life by what has been taken or lost, but by what I continue to create. My days are my own. My choices are mine to make. And each morning when the sun rises through the glass and paints the walls gold, I whisper a quiet promise to myself: never again will I let anyone else write my story. My name is Helen Miller. I am not a victim. I am not a lesson. I am a woman reborn, standing on the edge of the life I have chosen. And after all that has passed, I know this much with absolute certainty: my life is just beginning.